dinner last night, so we really got to get into some details. So I've been really excited for this interview. A lot of people know why I started this nonprofit and why I wanted to start interviewing people who escaped communist countries or who could share their family stories of what happened to them. And it's because when I went to college, there's a lot of stuff going on college campuses. I would say I had some more unique experiences, even than some of the crazy stories we see today. And that's because my roommate in college, I meet her on the first day, and I look on her wall, and there's a poster of Mao Zedong, Lenin, Stalin, Karl Marx, and Fidel Castro. And it said, "Welcome to the party." And these mass murderers and dictators had fruity cocktail umbrella drinks in their hands and party hats on their head. And now for me, I'm the daughter of a colonel in the military who just retired. He served in Operation Iraqi Freedom. He served on site at 9/11. I consider myself quite a patriotic little American girl, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm going to American University of all places in our nation's capital. I love history, and I was going to college to end up working in veteran services. That was my goal. And so you would think that I would know what to say if I meet a communist on a college campus with a poster of mass murderers and dictators on her wall. And I did not. And for me, that was a big awakening. The fact that I didn't know what to say, because here's what she said, that her ideas would bring justice and progress, end poverty in America, and uplift the working class. Those sound like nice things. And little Morgan at the time, I mean, what am I going to say to that? I knew that those guys were kind of bad, but she's saying sweet things, and she seems like she has great intentions. And I was kind of just rendered mute. I had no idea what to say to her. And so it was really disappointing for me. And that's what led me on this journey to figuring out why my generation doesn't understand the dangers of these ideas, why they have posters of these people on their walls, why they look up to them, why they wear Che Guevara shirts. And a lot of it leads back to the fact that we don't properly educate my generation and now multiple generations on the history of the 20th century and on how these dictators came to power, and really on the lies that they share as they're on the way to power. And so I've been really excited to not only hear your family's story, because it basically hits all of those points, but I would like to hear, first of all, what do you think about this story of mine with my communist roommate?
Morgan, first of all, thank you for having me. And your story, I think, is what's most relevant in our times. I'm a generation or two ahead of you. And so what I grew up to was a different world than what you're currently growing up to right now. I grew up for the most part in South Florida and Miami, Florida, during the 70s and 1980s, in really what was the height of the Cold War, during the Reagan era. That was my real first memories of growing up as a teenager and a youth in the backdrop of Miami, Florida, where I grew up in a family where, myself included, we were fortunate enough to leave, the hostility of a communist regime in Cuba, and all of our friends in the network that we kind of grew up with, everybody had their own personal story every story was alike, but yet unique at the same time. And I was a byproduct of that. And not unlike you, where I left, I mean, went from upstate New York to Washington, D.C. Well, my first experience leaving South Florida was I left South Florida, and next thing you know, on a tennis scholarship at the University of Toledo in Ohio, and next thing you know, I'm now in the center of a blue-collar town from the Rust Belt, and I would suspect that experience for you, not unlike for me, experiencing a different part of the country where they have different issues that pertains to them, was an eye-opener we all needed, and it was a tremendous growth opportunity, as it was for you, as it was for me, as it relates to the issue of socialism and communism, which I make no distinction between the two. That was when you finally leave home and you're finally, like, you have your upbringing and you finally are presented with that first confrontation of ideas and vision of the world. That's when you kind of find essentially your calling. That's all I knew, basically. I grew up in the backdrop of, like, communism's bad, what have you. And then you go to a different part of the country where they can't even locate Cuba on the map. and so you kind of have to branch out and begin that journey. And so that's when you start to define yourself as like, okay, I know what I believe in. What my experience is what college teaches you isn't to be that major to then go on and more often than not, whatever your major is not what you end up doing. College is supposed to teach you how to learn, and it's presenting that wide range of ideas. Most of it you don't agree with. Either it's like, either you're going to be persuaded to it, or you're going to do your research. Like, okay, I must formulate. I believe I'm right. I mean, I need to do the research as to why I am right, and I need to educate myself. And that is a challenge that I have for today's youth, is that if you believe whatever ideology, test it. If it's right, the facts will bear it out. If you're afraid of the facts, you'll be on the wrong side of history. In the case with your college roommate, I would suspect that we fell into the cycle that we find ourselves in now. Back in the 1980s, we're in the middle of the Cold War. Reagan had termed the Soviet Union as the axis of evil, and he really painted that picture, and accurately so. With all the horrors of communism, from the Bolshevik Revolution that'd been around since the late 19-teens, to now, people were aware of communism and its evils. Well, the funny thing happened when 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the Reagan administration, through his policies, helped bring down global communism as we knew it at the time. Well, next thing you know, a couple of years later, the Eastern Bloc nations become more westernized, and you think everything's all hunky-dory, what have you. Well, with the absence of that essential communist piece, people kind of forgot about it. And then a decade or so later, it gets romanticized again. And the funny thing with communism is, if you study the history of it, the next generation of future communists always, this is their main rallying cry. Oh, but this time will be different. Mm-hmm. It wasn't done right before.
Yes.
And there's been several pieces done on communism, why it's failed. And it's always the next generation says, oh yeah, but we'll get it right this time. You're never going to get it right, because it's a doomed, failed experiment, as some people call it. No, it's just a failed ideology.
Yeah. Well, I always laugh because a lot of people, I do a lot of college campus speeches and stuff, and they usually say the same things of, oh, we're going to be more like Nordic Europe, not like Venezuela, or it hasn't been done right. And for me, it's like, no, it's been tried. The problem is it fails after like step 2 or 3. And so, yeah, you never get to that full attempt of communism because it destroys the area way early on. And so it's really, really sad to see them say this.
What they fail to recognize is communism is great until the person you put in charge disagrees with your vision, mm-hmm. which is going to happen. In a democracy, we have leaders that are going to disagree, even leaders that we vote for, that all of a sudden, vote in a policy or something that, hey, I don't agree with that. There's just too much going on for everybody to agree on everything. The world was never designed for all of us to be monolithic, where everybody believes in the same thing, and so we need to learn how to work together and work out our differences for sure, but a system that basically just pummels you where you must believe this, a system that by design is designed to destroy the nuclear family, mm-hmm. where it's and to destroy any organized faith of any kind, where the head of the state is the idol, and when that begins as your premise, you're standing on quicksand. Yeah, it's going to go south.
Now, so this kind of leads us right into what happened in Cuba. So I feel like we're going to be debunking a bunch of things today.
Sure.
One of the things that I hear from American leftists is that Batista was the evil dictator, and thankfully Castro came in and saved the people. So can you explain to us what happened with the history of Cuba before Castro came and as they were coming? And what I would love to know, do you have any family stories? Because I know it was more so your parents that experienced this. Mm-hmm. Do you have any family stories of the promises that were being made, the propaganda that was being pushed by the Castro and the revolutionaries that were with him?
Oh, I mean, the propaganda is always a consistent propaganda that we've heard from the left, from the Bolshevik Revolution all the way now, where it's the working class. It's going to be equality for all. It's going to be, it's going to be better, essentially for everybody, so long as you have these, 3 or 4 people in charge calling all the shots, telling you what to do. So long as you agree with everything they tell you, it's all fine and good until you disagree with it. And then you have no recourse if you do.
So with Batista, is that what they were kind of saying, if he needs to be taken out, we need to
Yeah,
empower the people?
Look, at the end of the day, Batista was a dictator, which was a dime a dozen. And if you study Latin American history, the dictators were a dime a dozen, and they stick around and just be power in the hands of a few. And but as my mom would describe it, because we discussed, I would talk to her about Cuban history, and she lived through all this. My mom had, my grandfather, my mom's father was. Served in the Cuban military. He was an editor for the Havana newspaper. His name was Julio Gunard, and he actually the dictator at the time, back in the 1920s, General Machado, actually put a hit on my my grandfather, as he was. He was one of the 6 people who was in the process of overthrowing the government. So overthrowing of dictators and what have you is commonplace in the history of Latin America. That's nothing new. Fortunately, my grandfather was able to escape being executed there, and then my mom. And then later became a diplomat in Germany right before World War II, and so my mom got to experience a little bit of that.
Actually, let's talk about that, and then maybe we can get back to Cuba, because your mom has to go back to Cuba, right?
Right. Yeah. Because my mom's a central figure essentially on all this. She's in her early 90s now, and with dementia is unable to really articulate these stories. So these are the family stories that have been passed on. But she, she was an only child, and so her father was a Cuban diplomat in Germany in the late 1930s, and then she was in boarding school with all the diplomats, their children, whatever. They're kind of like separate. She had privilege, if you will, and so she was there for the marching of the Third Reich, and she saw it all. She was very young, and at this time in the 1930s, to provide proper context, the world did not know what was going on. They didn't know what was going on in Auschwitz and the atrocities being committed by Hitler. And nobody knew what was about to start in terms of World War II in that regard. But as it turned out to be fortunate for her, now, the full funny tangent on all that was my mom was in school. She was actually, one of her best friends was Rosenberg's daughter, which was, when you're a kid, you're just playing with other kids. You don't know any of this. And at that time, everything was in the dark. You had no idea.
Wow.
But as fate would have it, my grandfather, and he was still relatively young, caught pneumonia in Germany. And pneumonia back then, in the wrong place, wrong time, was that he ended up dying, and then my mom had to return with her mom back to Cuba with a casket and what have you. And it was a very difficult time. I mean, imagine being a 9-year-old, losing your dad, and now returning back to Cuba with a very uncertain future.
And what year was this?
This would have been late 30s. I can't.
Wow.
I mean, maybe 1939, but give or take
timing.
it. Yeah, literally, it was right before World War II, the outbreak, and years later, she's now a teenager and in her late teens, and she goes and is living in Spain. And she's going to art school, and she's doing some, she's living her life, what have you. And wouldn't you know it, the Spanish Civil War breaks out with Franco, what have you, and now she has to return back to Cuba. So now here she is having to essentially exile twice already, and she's still in her youth, what have you. And unbeknownst to her, years later, she would be, caught in the middle of the Cuban Revolution under Castro, and then eventually, come to the United States and exile for a third time. And so, if you ask me, it's a lot of the dementia she's experienced probably from the life anxiety she had to experience. So she suffered more than most anyone had to suffer, and that's something I feel that pain, for her.
Yeah.
That's essentially on there. But you're so from my in terms of my family history, what have you, my mom, those conversations I had with her when I was growing up, what have you, I always treasured, because she provided the context of the 20th century, probably better than I even recognized at the time. That now, as I reflect, is like, oh wow. I mean, it's different. It's one thing reading it from a book. It's another thing experiencing it from someone who lived it. And so her perspective is one that for me in particular, carries more weight. And so when, kind of going back in terms of describing a Batista and what was that like with that context as a backdrop, she would said, look, he was a dictator, but there was still freedom. You can pretty much have your way in Cuba, what have you, just so long as you didn't cross him. And that was a typical dictator of Latin America, what have you. Just don't get in their way, and you can kind of quite do
And
a
that's
lot.
something, so America's youth right now, they live in such privilege and such security, safety, luxury, that we see any poverty. And even though capitalism has eliminated 90% of it, we see any amount of poverty in America and we go, capitalism is evil. And then we see any kind of struggling, and we have a hard time understanding what I think is the comparative history of it could be so much worse, and we should be thankful for what we have and of course strive to be better. But we hear this concept of like, oh, but Batista was a dictator. He had to be taken out. This is a terrible concept. It's really hard for them to compute. And so I think it's great when you explain this kind of stuff.
And my response to the person who is arguing from the left and arguing for the principles of communism is, that's interesting. What's your definition of poverty? When you bounce back and ask them open-ended questions on asking them to articulate their definition of whatever that there's injustice. What injustice are you referring to? Expand on that. Elaborate on that. What specifically are you talking about? A lot of times that's when they're unable to articulate it, and that's when you really catch them.
Yeah. And what I love about it too, I hope in a positive sense that when they hear somebody like you explaining so casually that like, oh yeah, another dictator in Latin America, that's how things were. Yeah, human nature and mankind, it's kind of gruesome if you look at our history. And so that's why we should be even more appreciative of what we have in America. So I wish that they could see, and that would allow them to feel a little bit more comfortable, because the left, the professors, you have politicians, you have the media that wants them to be scared and unappreciative of what our country provides and the structure of government that we have, when in reality, we should be so thankful that we aren't in a situation where it's like, oh, another dictator, a dime a dozen. That's really
yeah. I mean, it was
to me.
essentially commonplace throughout the history of Latin America, right?
Yeah.
And it's yes, it's another dictator, but you could live your life, and you can come and go as you please.
Yeah.
So it's, at the end of the day, I ask this question. Examine the psychology of any individual that wants to be at the highest office, whether it be president or high-ranking official in the government. You mean to tell me that's going to come without any shred of ego? Maybe Mahatma Gandhi would have been one of those examples where someone who really humble, that really just wanted, really put the interests of others before them. Look, at the end of the day, the only individual that I have read about, that I have studied about, that really came to this earth, as set foot on this earth, for really providing that salvation, if you will, was Jesus Christ. Mm. Everyone else that's looking to be a leader of their country, they need to check their ego at the door. But we don't. But we don't have that. Look at the leaders you have today, and you have to ask yourself the question: who are they serving? Are they serving? Is this really truly a government of the people, for the people, by the people? Are they being truly honoring the Constitution? Are they strict constructionists as, hey, this is how the Founding Fathers intended, and I'm going to be loyal to that? Or did they get there because certain special interest groups put money in their pocket, and that's why they're there, and so they have to be beholden to them? Or do they just have their own ideology they want to impose on others?
Yeah.
You have to wonder, any elected official, or before you go into that voting booth, and whoever you cast a vote for, where's this person's heart at?
Yeah, and it's hard to tell these days. Speaking of which, so one of my favorite stories of how the transition from Batista to Castro took place is Castro and his people, they get to the shores, they have that first fight, and their numbers are small after that. And I heard this story, I watched a documentary on it where it talked about the lies that they would spread and the similar tactics of promising free things to the same way that the American left does and every other leftist group rising up in a country does. And I heard that they would steal animals from the evil landowners, the evil rich farmers, and they would give them to the peasants in the town, and they would say, see this? We just took these from those evil people down the road because it's not fair they have so much. If you stick with us, if you join us, we are going to do this, but tenfold. So this is what our movement is all about, and will you join us? Because this is right, this is fair. And it normalized the concept of wealth redistribution. And now we have that in America today with some other things. But do you have any tales of maybe what that was like as they came to power and what they were telling to the people?
They preyed upon the ignorance of the people. And any society that has fallen to socialism and communism, it was made available by ignorance. That opens the door to evil, always. And yeah, I mean, that's a common story where essentially they always have the attractive sales pitch, you know. And I remember my mom saying that they had neighbors or what have you. And the funny thing is a cowardice that's usually associated with these people, because my family had the opportunity to get out of Cuba in the early 60s, where it was much easier for family reasons. You know, my dad he was a lot of people that their well-being was dependent upon him, and so he held back. But my mom had many neighbors and friends within, you know, we were like, my mom saw through Fidel Castro from the get-go. And the people within our family know, was like, okay, no, this guy's a communist. We know he is. He hasn't announced it yet, but we totally know he is. And first of all, there were people in denial. Oh, no, he's no. People were fed up with Batista for whatever the reason. The funny thing is, you ask anyone who's still alive from that, could you tell us what was so bad about Batista? They couldn't even tell you anymore, because Castro put that to rest. You know, 80 years of a brutal communist dictatorship will do that to you. And so my mom always said, like, oh my gosh, we had so many neighbors and friends and what have you, some of the people that would be unassuming, that you wouldn't suspect, that basically, oh, maybe he's not so bad. Oh, but he's saying such nice things. Oh, how can someone who could say nice things about the people, what have you, how could he be so bad? That's the hook of the socialists. They romanticize it. Oh, wouldn't it be great to live in a world where everybody's equal, where you don't have this Yankee imperialism. That was a word Castro liked to use a lot. These imperialist Yankees that are coming in and basically is like, oh, you have to work for them, or you this, that, the other. Oh, that, as you said, evil landowner, what have you. They're taking your food. They're taking all that, boom. And it's the play of words. And all of a sudden, after a while, and that's all you hear, it sounds, and all of a sudden, hey, maybe you're going through a tough patch with an existing dictator. Hey, you know what? Or as my dad later says, like, hey, look, this is Latin America. You don't like the dictator, wait 5 minutes. He's going to get overthrown. There'll be another one. No one could have foreseen that that no one came after Castro after, here we are 83 years later, and it's still the same regime, just different name, same ideology. They get the buy-in through the rhetoric. Always remember with socialism and those on the left, it's symbolism over substance.
Progress.
Hypocrisy doesn't bother them at all, because it's all about messaging. It's all about imagery and messaging. And so people fell for that. Two things about Fidel Castro people need to understand. He wasn't just a run-of-the-mill dictator. He probably was, and through a good run there in the 20th century, that for all the evil reasons, because a lot of dictators are not the brightest, the Cuban people had an unbelievably bad luck with Castro from the standpoint where, from the evil that he came from, he happened to be very intelligent, using it for all the evil ways, because you can be intelligent and evil. He just used his intelligence for evil, ways, and he was also very lucky, quite frankly. So in terms of, as he came on board, at any moment in time, had the U.S. government been under, whether it been Eisenhower or the Kennedy administration, had they just been slightly more aggressive, the Castro regime would have never come to be. And the history would have played out differently.
Well, let's get into that.
Yeah,
So
so-
if we could talk about, I mean, you gave the timeline last night. Let's get started on that part.
Yeah, so essentially, all of a sudden, Castro is there. There were the little, minor Moncada attacks and what have you. I mean, look, the history is there. People can read that. So Batista's there. Castro comes into power, 1959, New Year's Day. People didn't understand that Castro didn't come in day one. This is a socialist country. That didn't happen day one.
No, he called himself a democratic humanitarian, even.
Oh yeah. So Castro kind of was coming in, and he was just a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there. During that time, the Eisenhower administration and particularly the CIA under Eisenhower, they were very weary of the communist ties of Fidel Castro. And so through the CIA, there was a program where they would train Cubans that, would then come to Miami, and Cuban patriots who were like, all right, we're going to overtake Castro when the time is right. And so they would have been, so there was a plan under the CIA, under the Eisenhower administration that, well, at the appropriate time, that, these CIA trained Cubans would, then return, invade the island, and with the help of U.S. air support, overtake the Castro army and then put in, a government that's more complicit with the United States. In that time, you had the 1960 election, Nixon and Kennedy, very close election. Nixon, was the vice president under Eisenhower at the time, so had he won the election, that plan would have continued probably without missing a beat. When Kennedy came into power in the transition, that plan, the way I understand history, was made available to him, and initially it was like that. Kennedy adopted the plan and said, "Yep, well, we understand the threat of communism 90 miles away from our shores, and we will honor this plan." Mm-hmm. Then, not so. We're talking about April 17th through April 20th, 1961. JFK is inaugurated January 20th of that year, 1961. So only a few months into office is when the first of the two most significant events took place, and that was the Bay of Pigs invasion. And then there was, the plan was U.S. supply air support. Then the CIA trained Cubans will come in, attack, boom. And had they gone through that plan, I think history would have, revealed that, hey, that would have been the end of Castro, and then the course of history would have been different. But events happened, and perhaps historians could probably, point to more specific reasons as to why. My mom was of the belief, because she was, living there, living through all of it at the time, that then I believe Adlai Stevenson, who was in the Kennedy administration, I believe the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and a close confidant to President Kennedy, he was uneasy about providing air support. He was uneasy about triggering the Soviet Union in any way during the height of really was the Cold War. And for whatever reason, whether it was him, whether it was his brother Bobby, or someone within someone got to President Kennedy and said, hey, you know what? I don't think we should go through with this. As push came to shove, the CIA trained Cubans were like, oh no, it's now or never. It's now or never. And so essentially, the invasion happened. Air support never came. Castro defeated them on the ground very easily. Without the air support, they didn't have a chance. And then that event only further solidified Castro's footprint on the island.
That's a deep betrayal too.
As you look at Cuban American history, and particularly the Cubans from South Florida that have emigrated and gotten away from communism, from that moment on, to now, that was the first of many betrayals, consistent betrayals from the left. And whenever there be a president of the United States that was of the left persuasion, the frustration has always been with the Cubans, like, wow, it's they can't get one right. and it really started there. The next one was in 1962, and that was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where, Castro's now president of Cuba. So from the Bay of Pigs up to that point, at that point, little by little, gradually, Castro starts forming his allegiance with the Soviet Union, and then the head of the Soviet Union was Nikita Khrushchev at the time. All of a sudden, Castro then announces one day, is like, well, this is a socialist country. I don't think he used the word communist, but this is a socialist country. And then at that point, now the concern for the Kennedy administration is, okay, well, we got a hot potato on our hands, and it's 90 miles away from our shores. Interesting, going back to after the Bay of Pigs fiasco for the Kennedy administration, a couple of days later, and I will give President Kennedy credit for this, he gave a very famous speech in the Orange Bowl, the football stadium where the Miami Dolphins and the Miami Hurricanes played for so many decades, in Miami, and in a crowd of a lot of Cuban supporters. They wanted to hear the president. All right, what are you going to do now? Your administration dropped the ball on this one. What are you going to do now? And it became, and to his credit, he's like, he took ownership for the Bay of Pigs. Buck stops with me, and I'm paraphrasing, where basically, but is his determination to, return to a free Cuba, before too long. Well, as history, would have it, that never materialized. But that was the beginning, really, of the nightmare for many, and
well, especially with that negotiation.
Shortly after that, Castro got closer and closer to Khrushchev and the Soviet Union, and next thing you know, you had, here we are, we're now in the fall of 1962, and satellite images are now presented to President Kennedy at the time, and it's like, ooh, wait a minute. These are missiles, and they're pointed directly at the United States. President Kennedy, as I understood through many people that I've spoken to, and historians, he wanted to make sure there were Soviet missiles. And through, after studying that closely, it was confirmed that these were Soviet missiles, and they're pointed at the United States 90 miles away from our shores. At that point, we all know the history of it, eventually a blockade of Cuba. And Kennedy gave that famous speech where any missile fired on the Western Hemisphere, the United States is going to consider it as an attack on the United States, and it will require a full retaliatory response. And then all of a sudden, then there was a famous 13 days.
Now, I find it fascinating that you say, well, and of course you know this, and then the infamous 13 days and all this stuff. Young people in America are not learning this. So that right there is quite a stark contrast, isn't it?
But yeah, and so this is an opportunity again to your former college roommate, if she ever hears this, is like, here's an opportunity to educate yourself on the real history as it happened, and because you're entitled to your own opinion, you're not entitled to your own facts.
Yeah.
What I'm giving as it relates to the 13 days and the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's
what happened.
It's what happened. It is a material fact that missiles were on the island of Cuba. It is a material fact that these were missiles from the Soviet Union. It is a material fact that the President of the United States then had to provide a response. In that response, it was a blockade. It happened. For 13 days, the world was wondering if World War III and a nuclear war was about to break out. I wasn't alive at the time, but I mean, all it takes is someone who's literate that could read the history books and is like, oh, wow. To deny that is to deny the Holocaust. It's to deny World War II happened. It's to deny World War I. I mean, either you're going to study history or not. So these are just, these are the facts as they are. Mm-hmm. And so it is also a fact that the 13 days ended, that World War III did not break out at that time. So how did that happen? Okay, and this is per, basically from the Kennedy administration. This is not anything. It is not covert or or any secret or anything. But essentially, as the 13 days carried on, both President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, they knew they needed a resolution, and it was high stakes, and the whole world was watching, and there was a lot at stake. Kennedy was like, if I don't get this right, this is not going to end well in terms of my presidency. And Khrushchev is the same way. I mean, he's, he had people he had to answer to back in Moscow. And so the way I understood, in terms of the way the history has been presented it, and been confirmed by others as well on the Cuban side as well as the U.S. side, that the Soviets sent a high-ranking official to meet with the Attorney General at the time, which was Bobby Kennedy, JFK's brother, in some secret, undisclosed location in Washington D.C. And the way history has depicted it, was like, the Soviet officials like, well, we're in quite a dilemma here. Khrushchev wants an honorable way out. What do you propose? And Bobby Kennedy's proposal was, our proposal is this: you remove the missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the United States promises never to invade Cuba. And there may have been some other things there, but that was at the crux of the resolution of the 13 days. So once, so that ended up being the case. The missiles were removed. The blockade had ended. World War III was avoided. That's all fine and good if you live in Topeka, Kansas. That's all fine and good if you live in Leningrad, or St. Petersburg, as it's called now. It's all fine and good for everybody, except for that freedom lover that lives in Cuba. And like, wait a minute. And the Cubans who had, made their way to Miami already at this point, like, but Mr. President, you gave your word that you were, going to do everything you could to make Cuba free again. So when people wonder why the Cubans and that had come over and exiled in the 1960s, why so many of them were disillusioned with leaders from the left, I hope people understand. They were sold out. Their freedom was a bargaining chip.
Yeah.
I understand that the stakes were high, but it was paid for by their freedom.
And so is that because now that Castro knew the U.S. wouldn't bother him, he kind of had free reign to get worse?
Well, let me correct one thing there. He didn't know that the U.S., because this was an agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States.
Oh, you're right. Okay, so he wasn't even involved.
So I have a dear friend now who years earlier was he now lives in Miami, but he was actually one of the individuals who was manning one of those missiles pointed at us, when I say us, the United States, pointing at the United States in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was very young, later grew up through the Cuban government and was sent to Moscow to study economics, and then later had a high-ranking position with the Cuban government, headed up the Young Socialist organization within the Cuban government before later on crossed wires with Fidel Castro, and they had some philosophical disagreements, which, you talk about dictators, you could not have a philosophical disagreement with Castro. And that brought an end to his role within that government there, and he later became a born-again Christian and resulted in, and then he's dedicated his life to Christ, and he's now much older now, and he lives in Miami, Florida now. So when I speak to him, because he's a great sounding board. His name's Jesus Ledesma, and because he was the one that asked me, Louie, how was the resolution of the Bay of Pigs invasion taught in the United States? And I always found that to be an interesting question. Well, wait a minute, you're on one of the missiles. You should know more than anybody. You tell me. And he said no. It was like, I told him, well, our version was, basically, Bobby Kennedy's proposal was ultimately accepted, and that's what brought an end to the crisis. And you know what? I've been wondering all these years. That had to be it. It's the only thing it could have been. And I go, what was the version? What was the Cuban version on the island? And he said, Fidel Castro basically gave it in a speech, and this was what was taught in Cuban history, where, well, these missiles are pointed at the United States. It is bringing high tension and anxiety. as the leader of your country, I do not, want to do anything that inadvertently would create an invasion of our sovereignty here. And so, in the best interest of the, of our citizens, we're going to retire the missiles. So, basically presenting a version where it was his call, which baloney. I mean, he had no say in the matter. Castro, and the thing that we were talking about earlier, how so many of these dictators or anybody in high position of government are driven by ego. And those high positions in government come with money and power, and that is the false idol drug that drives so many, and history bears that out. In the case with Castro, it was power. He wanted. I mean, he was such a narcissist. Probably a psychiatrist's dream to study. He was just one of the biggest narcissists the world has ever known. In the likes of a Hitler and Napoleon, he was that evil. And so anything that happened, he needed to portray the vision that he was the one always in control. In reality, it was Khrushchev and Kennedy basically coming to an agreement, and it's as if Castro wasn't even in the room, truth be told. To Castro's credit, in this regard, it would have been so easy for someone like that in a hemisphere where, like we talked about earlier, there was dictators were a dime a dozen. The fact that he survived that long, again, he was intelligent. He was also lucky. He was lucky that he happened to be the communist dictator in a country surrounded by a body of water, so you didn't have to worry about land invasion. He was able to control all the communication. He was able to avoid assassination attempts. He was able to avoid one U.S. administration after another, and putting pressure with the trade embargo and what have you. Darn, he was lucky, and much to the chagrin of the Cuban people.
Yeah, I think a large part of the story that I want to focus on is how your family got out. But before we get to that, can you just share with us some of the examples or what you heard about what it was like to live under his control in Cuba?
The early days were really ugly. A movie that I recommend everybody to see is an Andy Garcia directed movie produced, The Lost City. It's based on a fictitious storyline, but it's a backdrop that any Cuban family that experienced the Cuban exile can relate to. As I mentioned earlier, it's like all the stories are the same, but yet all very unique. And where it really describes that whole pattern of like that transition from just a run-of-the-mill dictator to a communist dictatorship under the thumb of the Soviet Union and hardline communism. And the Castro version of that hardline communism was even harder. So you're asking like, oh, okay, what were some examples literally, people take for granted the Bill of Rights in this country and our Constitution. There is no Bill of Rights under that form of government. They could do whatever they want to do. You have, no representation. If they say you did something, you did it. And if the crime is punishable by death by execution, if a military official wants to come by and clunk you on the head, it is absolute brutal.
Speaking of the officials, you mentioned something about the police. Yep. Can you tell us about that?
So Castro had a famous saying: "Dead people don't speak." Anyone that came in the form of opposition to Castro, he eliminated. It was in the most ruthless fashion. Firing squads, 6 a.m., commonplace. My brother's godfather spent 17 years as a political prisoner in Cuba through the help of Amnesty International and other international organizations, where he was very lucky to get out. My brother's godmother, his wife, just to be able to go visit him in the jails, what have you, was an ordeal. I'll let your imagination go, take it from there.
I also heard, so when they had the firing squads, they would invite family members of the people being killed, and it was to instill fear, so that those people would then go out and tell everybody in their community what they were just put through, and basically scare people away from having the same thing happening to them.
Fear is the number one. I mean, you see it today with Putin. You see it with with China, with Xi. You see it where basically fear is the ultimate motivator for a communist socialist government. Yeah, I heard these stories also where they would wake someone up 6 o'clock in the morning, take him out to a firing squad, it's all ready, aim, fire, and you're blindfolded, and they're expecting to be, next thing you know, they're firing rounds, and the person's like, wait a minute, they can't see anything, they're blindfolded, they're still here, what happened? Oh no, they just fired 10 feet to the side to the person, and just to scare him, and then they put him back in his jail cell. They would just destroy the will to live of everyone. Now, the funny thing is, you're talking about the language used by the socialists and the communists. What they would say is, oh, no. We just need to train, we just need to re-educate these people. Where basically, that's the way they kind of like bring them in line. It's like, oh, you just, you just kind of went astray. You just kind of, fell off the tracks a little bit, what have you. We need to re-educate you and so we can reintegrate you back into society and just get you to conform.
Be a good comrade.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Castro knew the early 1900s and when it gained its independence, and so strong Spanish ties. And so it was a country that a lot of Christians, a lot of Catholicism, and so within Christianity, the nuclear family is front and center. And one of the things that Castro, under communism, one of the first things they do is they want to destroy the nuclear family, and this is significant when we talk about later on how our personal story and how my family got out. But the destruction of the nuclear family was absolutely paramount to their ideology because they want the head of state, in this case Castro, to be your daddy. They didn't, I mean, in fact, they encouraged men, to have children with multiple mothers, what have you. At the end of the day, that nuclear family means nothing anymore. At the end of the day, you're going to give up this religion and what have you, which was brainwashing or what have you. No, this is an atheist government. God does not exist. I am your ruler. You do as I say.
Yeah. And so, what do you think about that with Black Lives Matter in America? It was written on their website. They got a lot of backlash and eventually deleted it because, I mean, they still have those core values, but now they just don't promote them on their website publicly, that they want to get rid of the nuclear family. And they also, when Fidel Castro died, they wrote a letter in his honor, praising him.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. It's a communist organization. Make no mistake about it. Black Lives Matter is a communist by ideology and principle. They want to essentially the whole entire breakdown of the nuclear family, and that's their idea of as the way they've presented it. And if I have it wrong, they're more than welcome to try to articulate it better to me. But they want essentially everybody equal. The problem is everybody's equally miserable.
Yeah. Now, similar to that connection to Black Lives Matter, we were talking about Antifa last night. You told me that when he got into power, he killed the police.
Like I said, Castro's famous saying is he was so paranoid, dead people don't speak. So it was not uncommon for him to just assassinate just policemen from the previous regime. He's like, nope, he considered them basically might as well have been part of the army as far as he was concerned. These were, they weren't civil people. No, these were, it was brutal. And Che Guevara oversaw a lot of the assassinations in Cuba. He was a henchman for Castro. So basically, this was part of Castro's evil intelligence, where it's like, okay, anybody that could present a threat to my existence here, I need to eliminate them. And boom, dead people don't speak. So so a lot of the policemen were killed. My dad lost friends from high school, through that, and it was extremely painful. I couldn't. I try to put myself in my dad's place, in terms of like, my goodness, I'm so close with my high school buddies. We have our text thread, what have you, and then they're scattered, throughout the East Coast, and most of them in Miami, and I couldn't imagine all of a sudden being overtaken by a government that next thing you know they're going to be assassinated because of a position they held as a civil servant. So when you talk about, you're talking about, those other things, you're talking about defunding the police and this animosity towards the police. And like, wait a minute, look, no organization is perfect. Everyone, there's bad actors everywhere. But to paint it all with one big broad brush to promote an evil ideology, wait a minute, who's behind all this? That's when I start asking questions.
Well, and the same thing, and I don't want to get too much into this, but it just reminds me of it so much, where people are losing their jobs for not complying with a certain requirement. You know what I'm talking about.
Yep.
And people have talked about how it's similar to Cuba, with getting rid of people that could pose a threat to you or any dissenters in serious organizations, and so that could be in the military or the police. It's one way to do it, to have all of them fired.
You've seen the reactions in Canada, and you've seen the reactions a little bit in Australia. You've seen like just the marches in Europe, where all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a minute, time out. There's one thing about confronting a pandemic and kind of doing it the right way, but this is our individual freedom here. And there are medical reasons why, people want to, either conform or not conform. And when all of a sudden, we're talking amongst my friends or what have you, is like, wow, isn't it funny how all of a sudden my body, my choice all of a sudden became a thing of the past? Like, wait a minute, when did that argument go out the window? But it goes back to the hypocrisy of the left. So it's now that is, that's kind of like, and people need to understand is like, it starts with that. Now, one thing is losing your job. In Cuba's a case, you're losing your life.
Yeah.
That was a much more extreme version. I mean, like I say, Castro's version was amongst the most extreme in the history of all communist countries in that regard, because he could. It's a small island surrounded by water and sharks, and basically he had the run of the mill. And so anybody that posed a threat, more often than not, they were eliminated. And, some of the lucky ones, like my brother's godfather, was able to live to tell about it. Those early years of communism, where, oh my God, they're saying all the right things. Oh, everybody's equal, and you're taking in all that rhetoric, and the romanticizing of it all, and then all of a sudden, like, oh yeah, well that's nice, and then all of a sudden you're told to shut up and fall in line, and if you don't, it's you're going to get, I mean, you'll be lucky to live. The confiscation of all the properties, all the radio stations were confiscated by the government. Banks, were taken over by the government. Basically, your entire way of life. And nightclubs were in the movie, The Lost City. It was like, it's like, oh, the saxophone was considered part of the, was considered a capitalist, an evil, instrument type of thing. And the whole sense, like, wait a minute. Those people who were, all of a sudden one day they were like, oh, maybe Castro's not so bad. Next thing you know, they're like, oh, wait a minute, I didn't sign up for this.
Yeah.
And those were the ones who say, like, oh, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe we need to give it a chance. Those are the cowards, because they're the first ones out the door when the rubber hits the road, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait a minute. It's all fine and good until they do something you don't agree with. I mean, that's and the thing is, there's no recourse. With the current, with the Constitution of the United States, and for the strict constructionists, and God bless our Supreme Court justices that adhere to strict constructionism in interpreting the Constitution the way the founding fathers intended, because that's to me that's what really protects us from that administration or that next generation that wants to do away with our civil liberties.
I want to transition into how your family left, because it's fascinating, and I think a lot of people are going to enjoy it, whether they care about the history of communism or not. It's a thriller. But I have one last question. A lot of people, and I think conservatives and just anti-socialist people in America, they know it's bad, and I think we really struggle to communicate why it's bad. A lot of us will say things like, oh, well, you don't have much option when you go to the grocery store, and food is limited, and they talk about more so the economics of it and the supply and demand, but there's an essence of control that plays a huge part in this. And it's the concept that the government is now the only provider of really key services and products that you need to go about your day. And so you mentioned that under communism, your life can be taken from you, not just literally, but also figuratively, in the sense that if you don't comply, if you don't show up, like these fake elections that Cuba will have, if you don't show up and do what they ask of you, they will take away basic necessities in your life that make it really hard to get by. And can you talk about maybe that, and then what led also to your family wanting to make that decision to go?
Yeah, Big Brother's hard brother, and it is not love. Um, and so in the case, with Cuba during, that time period, a lot of people don't realize, and this is where, going back to, the policy of previous administrations that tried to open up trade, with Cuba and what have you. I would have people come in and say, like, oh, Louis, isn't it great the U.S. is going to open up trade with Cuba and this, that, the other? I'm like, are they opening up trade with Cuba? With the Cuban people, or are they opening up with the Cuban government? One must make the distinction. Many people don't know. Most don't. It is illegal to have your own business in Cuba. I mean, like private business ownership, which we take for granted in the United States, it's illegal in Cuba. It's illegal to own a boat in Cuba. Wait a minute. An island surrounded by water? You can't own a boat? No, you're a flight risk. I mean, you've owned a boat. Next thing you know, 90 miles later, you're in the United States. For that reason, the common Cuban people will never. It's funny. I mentioned my friend Jesus Ledesma, who now lives in Miami. Whenever when he first came and finally moved from Cuba to Miami, and he was able to get out. Anytime we would go out to eat, whatever, he always ordered fish. I was like, I mean, you must really like fish. He's like, no, in Cuba we couldn't eat fish. Nobody owned a boat. How are you going to get it? and that's what kind of it really brings it. It brings it home. I mean, it really hits home, where you can't own your own business, you can't own your own boat. You literally are dependent on, if you eat, it's because a government hands you something.
Yeah.
There's the whole concept of entrepreneurism does not exist in modern day Cuba, and did not exist in Castro's Cuba.
Well, that, and even just taking care of yourself. I mean, I've heard stories of people. The Cuban people are starving, and you cannot go into the water and grab a lobster, for example. Like, you cannot pick up a lobster and go cook it for yourself, because that's government property that is saved for the tourists.
Well, it's interesting in recent years, because the starvation is so bad in Cuba, and a lot of people don't realize how bad it is now. The government's kind of looking the other way. This is not Castro's, communist government. So there's some things that kind of where we see it, but we don't see it, type of thing.
Okay.
But during the day, going back to the 1960s, essentially you couldn't, the farmers and their land, that wasn't their land. Everything there was now for the people. It was for the government. And if you tried to live off of that land or what have you like that, there were serious repercussions. You own nothing, essentially, on that. And so now segueing to our personal story, I'm the youngest of four. My oldest brother, who now lives in London, is 13 years my senior. I have a second oldest brother who's got me beat by 7 years, and then my sister by 3. So I'm the young one, and no, the youngest is not the most spoiled, contrary to popular belief, but that's a story for another day. But in Cuba, at age 15, during the Castro regime, they would not let you leave the country. Because at that point, they want you to serve in the military, which at that time, in those years, Cuba sent a lot of their youth to fight in Angola, to fight for communism in Africa, essentially there. So you can imagine how undesirable that was. In addition to that, at age 15, that's prime, physical shape years for a boy. So they're going to send you to the sugarcane fields to do manual labor. That was part of the deal. So my father was a psychiatrist. He was the director of the National Sanitarium in Havana. It was called San Juan de Dios, and he oversaw the whole country, lead psychiatrist under the regime. He realized that, oh my gosh, we got to get out of here. The dynamic of our family was, my dad was the only one that went to college in his immediate family. Not only was the 4 of us all dependent upon him and my mom, but his sister was dependent on him. His brother was dependent on my uncle. Was dependent on him, and his mother. His father passed away in 1967, so he was still alive at the time. So basically, he provided for everybody. And so he felt that burden on his shoulders that he needed to provide, and but he wanted him. It got to the point where it's like, oh, wait a minute, this isn't going anywhere. That naivete that he had, that the United States is never going to allow communism 90 miles away from its shores, that came and went, and the reality is it was here to stay. And so I was like, all right. But he had missed the window to get us all out. That window was really the early 60s when you were able to get out much easier. Now, the hardline regime is in, and it was not so easy to get out. And that's one of the things that always baffled me about these communist dictators and just these communist governments, going back to East Germany and the Eastern Bloc countries during the Cold War, and Cuba in particular. Is like, wait a minute, wouldn't it be easier if someone doesn't want to be there, just let them go? That's one less mouth you have to feed. I always essentially wondered that, but it all goes back to the tyranny and the evil that they really want their people to suffer. And especially those that, you don't want to be a part of this, they really want to make you suffer. They want to stick it to you.
Yeah.
And
especially if you're caught trying to escape, they make an example of you.
No, oh yeah, if you live to tell about it. And so at this point, now my oldest brother's 13, 12, 13 years of age. And then all of a sudden my dad's like, oh, he's getting too close to that age. It's we got to make a move, and it's now. But my dad, to his credit, he's like, okay, my first responsibility, I know I got a lot of people depending on me, but my first responsibility is my immediate family, my wife and my children. And I'll always be grateful to him for that, amongst other things. But that's that's really high up there. And so he's like, all right. Now, what my mom also impressed upon him was like, okay, we got to get out of here. But my mom made it very clear: either all 6 of us get out together, or nobody gets out. We're not dividing the family. The family stays together. That was my mom's insistence on there, because and this has been documented on many instances where I mentioned there's so many everybody's story is alike, but yet everyone's unique. Cubans who were fortunate enough to get out after things really closed down, and from the mid-60s on, it wasn't easy. And a common practice, which has been confirmed by multiple people who are within the Cuban government, that when, let's say, a family would get out there, right, okay, we got permission, you arrive to the airport, what have you, and you have all your documentation. Let's say it's a family of 5. I think Armando Salguero, a writer for the Miami Herald, had a personal story that he wrote about where, one time he was in a post-game interview with Colin Kaepernick, who had a T-shirt with Malcolm X and Fidel Castro, and Kaepernick was able to articulate Malcolm X, but he really didn't know anything about Castro. And he's like, why do you have a T-shirt about Castro, especially in Miami of all places? I mean, it's kind of insensitive, wouldn't you think? And he really couldn't answer that question. And in an article, Salguero basically writes like, yeah, my family was one of those families where it was 5 of us, and I had my 2 other siblings. I think it was either 1 sibling or 2 other siblings. And his parents, they got to the gate, they had all the documentation to leave, and what was common practice for 2 reasons, you had like a man in battle fatigues, military personnel with an AK-47 just walking around, and all of a sudden, right as about to board the plane, he's like, all right, oh yeah, I see a family here of 4 or 5 or what have you, and oh, look at this. Yep, you have the documentation to leave, but you know what? Right now I'm the one in charge, and 3 of you get to go, the others have to stay. You got 5 minutes to decide. And they, again, it goes back to, and so this confirmed through Jesus Ledesma, who worked literally at the high levels of the Cuban government under Castro, and he was like, those 2 reasons for that. Number 1, it goes back to the breaking up of the nuclear family that they were hell-bent on. But there was also a secondary reason where Castro didn't want people just leaving Cuba, coming to the United States and bad-mouthing the Castro government. By keeping family members in Cuba, that was his way to kind of control the situation and maybe control the narrative a little bit and make them a little more reluctant to trash the Cuban government. And so that was a brutal practice of breaking up families that existed all throughout the Castro years. And so my mom was very weary of that. And she wanted to make sure, it's like, no, under no circumstances are we to be split up. We're going together, or we stay here together, but we're staying together.
I mean, that sounds traumatizing. Did your parents ever as a couple say, this might happen and we might split? Or did they make the decision, if that happens to them, they'll just leave the plane together? And
No, my mom made it very clear early that under no circumstances were we splitting, period, end of discussion. If it meant that we all had to stay, we all stayed. And so that was predetermined early on when the initial discussions are on how we're going to get out. That was established internally with our family that was going to be the case. We will choose not to split up.
So how did you avoid this?
All right. So my dad, being the director of the National Sanitarium, one of his patients was the then Swiss ambassador to Cuba, Alfred Fischli. Was a key player in the 60s and the 70s in Cuba-U.S. relations. At the time, after Castro basically took over power in Cuba, all diplomatic communication between the United States and Cuba had ceased. So there was no dialogue. There was no U.S. embassy in Cuba, and there was no Cuban embassy in the United States. So the Swiss ambassador was the intermediary between the two countries. Through the Freedom of Information Act, I was able to get my hand on some documents that established that Fischli was basically the key intermediary between the United States and between the United States and Cuba, and that Mexico was a proxy where, as it related to, in that time there was a lot of hijacking of planes of people either wanting to return back to Cuba or come to the U.S. or what have you. And how did we do this? And so Mexico was used as a proxy for that and other issues to help resolve returning people to their homeland or what have you, as kind of like, okay, keep them there as a holding place for a little bit. So on that, so my dad basically approached the Swiss ambassador. He says, "Hey, I got to get my family out of this country. We don't care where it is. Can you help us get out?" The key words from the Swiss ambassador is, "Dr. Iglesias, you've been so good to my family. I can never repay you for all the good things you've done for me personally." I can only imagine being the Swiss ambassador at that time, in between those two worlds, the anxiety that man had to experience. I never had a chance to meet the man, but boy, I have 1,001 questions, that I'd love to ask him. And he turned to my dad and he basically said, "I will get you and your family out. Just one condition." He's like that. "Don't ask any questions." All right. My dad didn't ask any questions. Next thing you know, okay, time passes, and next thing you know, we got the permission to leave. We got the plane tickets. The only thing was we had to go to Mexico first. We had to, and so the understanding was like, all right, you got your plane tickets to Mexico City, you got your visa to Mexico, and what have you, and then you got, all right, so and then, so you go to Mexico. And then what you need to get in Mexico from the U.S. Embassy is the visa to enter the United States. And others had done that, and it's usually a process that's just a couple of days, maybe a week or so, at the most. That so that was the expectation, essentially, that was built. So, all right, we're good. Now we just need to just kind of go through the process of leaving the island, and so this will be an education for many. So when you leave a communist country after you've been given permission, at least in the case with Cuba, the government comes, a government official comes in and does an audit of your house and all its belongings, because you're not allowed to. I mean, you're only allowed to take basically the clothes on your back.
Wow, like that alone is insane.
Yeah. So it's not like, hey, we're gonna get 20 suitcases and some
like you're gonna
and some
pack up your
tote bags
furniture
and some totes and we're no get
Wow.
reality check here. No, basically everything is roped off and they do an audit, and now when you leave, all that now becomes property of the government.
Wow.
It's a bit fun, but so the day came, the gentleman came in, he was going through the audit, what have you, and just in just typical conversations. Oh, so you guys are leaving and this, that, the other, and so all 7 of you are leaving and what have you. And at this point, I was born. I was only a few months old, and oh no, our maid is staying, and so we had a maid and who had been with the family 12 to 15 years and was basically part of the family. In Cuba, the word tata is referred to our maid, and I remember Mom always spoke very fondly of her Josefina, and so it's she was part of the family, and then the Cuban official just absolutely went nuts, basically blew a gasket, and basically read our maid the riot act. How is it in this day and age, in this government, that you are still serving basically, you know, the white man or whatever, where you're here as their maid and that's beneath you, what have you. We're all equal now, and this, that, the other. And it's like they're my family. And like, I mean, I don't see what the problem is. I mean, they take very good care of me, and this is my job, and I love what I do. And so at any rate, he was enraged, and so he left, and basically gave the orders like, this family does not leave until you find a home for that, for the maid. And then all of a sudden she left, or he left, and all of a sudden my family was like, all right, we got a pickle here. Trying to find a home for anybody in those times, I'm not going to say impossible, let's just say it wasn't the easiest task in the world. We were slated originally to leave on January 6, 1970. And so now that date was in jeopardy, and clearly we didn't make that date. But my dad, he's like, hang on, I got a trump card here that I'm going to play. And that card was, years earlier, being a doctor, he had saved the life of a very high-ranking Cuban official that was most grateful to my dad. And he said, thank you for saving my life. If you ever, if I can ever do anything for you, you come see me. So my dad kept that in check, and he waited for the right moment to lay down that card. And so he went to him, and he's like, Dr. Iglesias, I owe you this one. Don't worry, we're going to find a home for her. And then he basically gave our maid, basically, here's 6 different living arrangement options. You're going to get, we're going to go and see. She was so humble. She was so sweet. She's like, I don't want to cause anybody any trouble. The first apartment's going to be great. And the first apartment was bigger than she was living in, with us and anything. And there's, oh my gosh, thank you for taking. She was very grateful. We got it. Boom. Now came, that part actually ended up being a lot easier. The harder part was, okay, now we got to track down this Cuban official who basically said we can't leave until we find a home for our maid. And so now that step has been completed, there's, the way my brother described it, as he would tell the story, is because he was 13, he remembers all this clearly. And he was saying, it was like, okay, there was, I guess, like the center where in Havana, where like the buildings where like a lot of the bureaucratic buildings were, and they were at this key building, and they know that he officers. Now this isn't the days where you just send a text to someone, hey, hey, when can we meet? No, I mean basically the communication was not easy, especially in that government, especially to a government official, not easy to get to. So the whole family, we were there, and we were kind of in the main lobby where all the traffic. You see all the people kind of going in and out, with the hopes that we would just see that man. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, after being there for a while, and all of a sudden, my brother spotted him halfway across, all about ready to get on the elevators, and he just made a beeline. My brother was fearless. He went up to, and you can just imagine, like, a little 13-year-old going up to us. Mister, yeah, we're the family came to see us, not long ago, and that we needed to get a home for our maid, and once we did, you give us, the papers for us to leave, and all of a sudden he's looking down and he was stunned, that wait a minute, it's like, yeah, I remember you, and he looked over and saw like my mom and dad, what have you, is like shocked that you found a home for her and that quickly. I mean, it was taken back by all that. Mm-hmm. So he came over and talked to my parents, and then he was cordial, and then I was like, all right, and then the process of auditing the house, what have you, that part was not complete. Everything is kind of roped off, and in true socialist and communist fashion, what have you, is like my brother, as he would tell me the story was, it's like, yeah, so it was all roped off with this, that, the other, but then later we went back and we just kind of like took a couple of items, whatever, and they never knew about it. So it was like, again, symbolism over substance, right? Yeah. And so Then our exit date then gets pushed back to February 6th of 1970, and that is the date that we left the island. And so my mom and my dad were for good reason that they had a lot of anxiety centered around that date. Because now we have all the documentation we need to leave the island to go to catch the flight to Mexico. And so as we get there, my brother was, we're at the airport, and then there's like an glass casing where my sister and my two brothers and myself, we're held there. My brother had to kind of carry me because I was a month old, because my mom and dad had to basically present all the documentation and what have you. And so this is a part that my brother didn't witness, but my mom, because he what was there, and my mom told me years ago where she was worried about that military person coming through and splitting us up. And sure enough, as they were presenting all that, per her story was, gentleman came in, oh, so what do we have here? He took a look at all the documentation, what have you, but on that particular day, at that particular moment in time, in history, he looked at it all, became very angry and belligerent, took his fist, slammed it on the counter, and walked away. We could not be broken up. Something was in that documentation that overruled him. Mm-hmm. And clearly he wasn't happy about it. At the airport, we had like our cousins and our friends and our relatives that took us to the airport. We finally make our way to the plane. And in those days, you kind of go outside, and then you kind of go take the stairs up to, staircasing up to the airplane, and they could see it from the window. And my mom's, the way my brother depicted it, my mom and my brother, my mom and my dad. My mom was holding me in her arms, and the two my mom and my dad were just crying endlessly. They couldn't even look out the window to wave at their friends. My dad, at age 46, did not know if he was ever going to see his mother again, his brother again, his sister again, our cousins. We were leaving family, never knowing if we were ever going to see them again. As it turned out, my dad was able to make a couple return trips to see his mother, but he was not there when she died. He was not there when his sister died. He was not there when his brother died. He was not there, when his mother died. Imagine being in another country, not being able to be there when your parent dies or your sibling dies. Again, the horrors of communism. And so we arrive in Mexico, starting a new life. We stayed at the National Hotel in Mexico, which has since been torn down, but it was, the way my brother described it, was quite a colorful place. That's where a lot of it was a hotel where they housed a lot of the families that were kind of going through Mexico in passing. They just needed a visa or what have you, and it was, he said, a lot of characters. There are a lot of, it was like out of a movie where just different personalities. But we were there. We had very good friends of ours that years earlier had left Cuba and lived in Mexico. One, she happened to work in within the Mexican government. Her husband, I think, worked for the Mexican government, and they had very strong connections there. So, but they were there really more for, hey, it's nice to have someone
Yeah.
while you're going through that. Again, we thought we were only going to be there just a couple of days. Mm-hmm. Just go to the U.S. Embassy. It's like, hey, we're just waiting for the U.S. visa, and we got everything approved, right? And so we're just waiting for that visa to come in. Well, days turned into a week. Weeks came and went, and next thing you know, a couple weeks go by, and like, wait a minute, my mom and my dad are starting to get concerned. Like, well, why isn't that visa in? We should have had it by now. And the anxiety with my parents is like, wait, we're not in the U.S. yet. At any moment in time, we could be sent back. That fear is real. They even had our friends there kind of looking, hey, through the Mexican government, can you kind of investigate this, see what's the hold up here, this whatever. The inquiry was made, and they were told, don't go any further. It is out of your hands. As if, and that was strange even to them. It's like, wait a minute, usually I have access to a lot of this information. Like, why? But I don't. I'm being closed off here in a way that's unprecedented even for us.
Of course.
And so all of a sudden, so now concern's really settling in. But 3.5 weeks later, roughly or so, The visa came in, it was under my father's name. And then next thing you know, it's March 6th, and we're on the plane, and we go to Miami. So here we are in Miami. We arrive. At that point, my dad had, arranged that we were in Miami for a couple of days, and then my dad's first job was, even though he's a doctor, he hasn't passed any state medical boards, whatever, so he couldn't practice medicine yet in the United States. So, but he can do, other functions that what have you. And we had friends from med school that are longtime friends of the family as well that lived in Dayton, Ohio, and were able to set them up with the first, hey, look, here's a first job, just to get you started until you get under your feet at the VA hospital in Dayton, Ohio. And so we were going to be in Miami a couple of days, and then we went to Ohio. But when we arrived in Miami, our friends, who were taking us in and helping us, and God bless them, they were, when in that situation, that they were like knights in shining armor, where all of a sudden they just took us, this family with 4 kids, and they had never, many of them never met before, and it was as if we were extended part of their family, and they were, long time, dear friends of ours. So they were there, and they're like waiting at the airport for us in Miami. And next thing you know, all right, so when we arrive, okay, we're not exactly, coming in, we're coming from Cuba essentially. So they had to put us in a room, and they need to, check off all the boxes and kind of, review documents and things of that nature. And, process we didn't expect it to take, that long, as per my brother Way was explaining to me. But we were held in a room basically with, no one coming in basically for 45 minutes, maybe an hour, or what have you. And all of a sudden it was like, okay, well, what's taking so long? What's taking long? Again, all the fears kind of come in. Are they going to let us in, or what have you?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden a U.S. official then opens the door and comes in and is very apologetic for the wait, and says, oh, Dr. Iglesias and family, we apologize, for making you wait, what have you, but, welcome to the United States. We're, happy to have you here, and here's some documentations that you're going to need. We had, amongst them, we had the U.S. residency. Okay, in and of itself is not a shock. But what was a shock to all of us, okay, yeah, we had the green card to get in there. And then my mom's, okay, now what's this? And then next thing you know, the U.S. official kind of hands us, like, yeah, here's the residency. So upon arriving in the United States, we had the residency. Now, we didn't know what a big deal that was at the time.
But that's significant.
That is very
And it's
significant.
very hard to get.
Yeah, it's hard to get. So in the typical process of, when someone immigrates to the United States, and part of the immigration process, the first step is getting the green card, and there's some time for that. And then, after a couple of years, you get to residency. And once you get to residency, then, years later, you can apply to become a U.S. citizen. It's a process that on average, I think it was about 11 years,
Yeah,
usually
many
to
years.
become, it's many years, essentially on there, which, without getting into, the other issues of current day. But it's a lengthy process. But we arrived in this country, we already had the green card in hand, and then we leave the airport with the U.S. residency in hand. Our friends basically, when we told them the news, my mom told them the news, like, yeah, we even got the residency. Their jaws hit the ground. They're like,
Yeah.
who in the world do you guys know?
Yeah.
And my dad's like, yeah, I pulled some strings with the Swiss ambassador, and that was it, And so basically, we didn't think anything of it. From our standpoint, it's like, we thought that was normal. As my siblings and I, we got older and became educated in the United States and started to learn and became old enough to really understand the process of immigration and how all that works and how we came in. Then we start to ask some questions, what have you, and it was always a mystery to us. How did we have the U.S. residency upon arrival at the United States? So years later, fast forward, so we always knew, we always wondered that. One of my, I was working at a country club in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I became very good friends with someone who was very passionate or just very intrigued by just Cuba, its history and what have you, and was always fascinated by how we got out. And I told him that, and he's like, okay, now that is really unique. That's not typically what's supposed to happen. And so, as it turns out, he later gets married, moves out, and then his wife's working at the State Department in Washington D.C. years later, and all of a sudden I get a phone call out of the blue. And in this phone call, he's like, hey, how you doing? What have you? We're catching up, whatever. He's like, hey, you know what? My wife's working at the State Department now. Is it okay if we kind of do a little research to the Freedom of Information Act, see what information we get? I'd love to find out more how you guys got out of Cuba. I'm like, hey, whatever information you can provide for us, more power to you. Go for it.
Yeah.
And then he comes back with some documents where basically the documents I have is just to establish one thing. The likely scenario, based on the information that was able to be gathered, was roughly between 1965 and 1973, there was a spy exchange between Cuba and the United States. The way it was organized and why it was organized was, and it made total sense, where 1965, that puts us 3 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. In that time of a lot of anxiety, Fidel Castro was still convinced, and through his paranoia, that the United States was going to invade Cuba, regardless of what the agreement was coming out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In return, the then President Johnson at the time, he wasn't convinced that the Soviets weren't going to try to sneak missiles back onto that island. So in the Cold War, distrust was everywhere. And so between the Cuban government and the U.S. government, and the person who would have known about all this was Alfred Fishley, the Swiss ambassador. And obviously, the country of Mexico had to play a role as a proxy in all this. That the agreement was made through back channels that a spy exchange program would exist. And in that spy exchange program, that the U.S. would have spies in Cuba for the sole purpose of just making sure checks and balances that the missiles did not return. In return, Cuba would have spies in the U.S., scattered between South Florida and D.C. Should ever there be real chatter of a U.S. invasion of Cuba, that Fidel Castro would then be tipped off to that. And then that way the two countries could kind of keep themselves in check, and through those checks and balances help bring the tensions down between the countries. That was, essentially the purpose of the program. So it started during the Johnson administration, and it carried through to the Nixon administration. I think it was discontinued during the Nixon administration, per the information that was provided, to me, and that's been confirmed on the U.S. side and the Cuba side.
Okay.
That program existed. Now, how it pertains to our family is like, okay, that's all fine and good, nice tangent. What did we have to do with all that? We were not spies. Not even close. If you ever knew my dad was Homer Simpson, I think in real life, but at any rate, no. That's no. My dad was a doctor. He was definitely not a spy, but so the Swiss, so essentially, the Swiss ambassador used that program because it was through that program that was. So what do you do if the identity of a spy is compromised? How are those situations handled? So per that agreement, all right, there's a spy, all of a sudden becomes a flight risk, or it's time to take him out of circulation, that too. Next thing you know, they are detained, taken aside, taken out of circulation, sent to Mexico City for 30 days, and then sent to the country of origin. Mm-hmm. And that way they kind of remove themselves from the footprint and quietly exit stage left, if you will. Mm-hmm. That's how they handle that. The Swiss ambassador basically was like, all right, we're going to take this family, boom, Mexico City for 30 days. We just, again, going back to the first thing the Swiss ambassador said, we couldn't ask questions.
Yeah. So
they couldn't tell us why we were in Mexico for 30 days, but that's the reason why. Mm. And so that was information. So that spy exchange, program that existed in that time was confirmed, by someone who worked in the State Department on there. And then the other friend of mine who worked literally at the high ends of the Castro regime is like, oh yeah, that plan was definitely in place, and he's convinced that there's no other possible way that your family could have gotten out based on the facts as they were,
Yeah.
because that's the only way you would have been able to, gone to the United States and had in hand the residency. We entered the United States on the 6th of February, and by July 4th, 1976, not basically 6 years later, we were United States citizens.
Wow.
And yeah, that's to say that's a fast track is an understatement. And so, so it's not lost upon me that the Lord and my Savior Jesus Christ opened the door for all of us to come to this country. So it's not lost on me that I'm here for a greater purpose. I'm here to serve Him, and so, however I can educate folks on the horrors of communism and bring more folks to Jesus, that's my passion, and that's why I'm here in any way, shape, or form I can serve in that capacity. And I am forever grateful, essentially, for that. This still remains the greatest country on God's green earth. And we have to make sure we learn the lessons of the past, suffered by others, so we don't repeat them going forward.
Thank you. I mean, thank you for sharing your story and doing all that work, and thank you for being here today.
Okay.
With everything going on, I mean, 70% of young Americans right now, according to a Gallup poll that came out recently, would choose socialism over capitalism. Multiple other polls show that at least a majority of young Americans favor socialism over capitalism in other ways as well, whether they would vote for a socialist over a capitalist or what it may be. When you see that kind of stuff, what are your thoughts on that? Because in your country, you were able to say, if we need to, we'll go to America. What are your thoughts on the fact that we can't exactly go to Canada?
What our youth needs to understand is that once socialism, capitalism is here, there's no turning back. It's not like, oh, we'll try this for a little bit and then go to something else. And what they also need to realize, Cubans in the 1960s, those who were fortunate enough, had a place to go. If they were lucky to make it to the shores of the United States, they were the lucky ones. In this day and age, in the year 2022, there's nowhere else to go. We are the last bastion of freedom in the United States. And what I would say to those who are polled that answer that question, they prefer socialism over capitalism, I would suggest to you that they have not done their vetting properly. They have not educated themselves properly in terms of what is communism and what is socialism and what truly is capitalism. Our leaders of today, and it's a disappointment in those on the right, and it's really an indictment on those on the left, have not done an adequate job of educating our youth on those economic models and the distinctions to be made between the two, especially when you look back over the past 100+ years since the Bolshevik Revolution, of just the horrors of communism. And communism killed more people than Hitler ever did. And with total ignorance, that's not recognized. Mm-hmm. And so right now they're getting a glorified, as you were talking about earlier, the romanticized version of, what it could be, when the reality is quite the opposite. And I, for one, am sick and tired of capitalism being absolutely, just spoken in like evil form. There is no other country in the world where you can amass the wealth you can in this country. There's no other country in the world where you can live as free as this country. Is this country perfect? No. But you can't paint a broad brush and use that as justification to rule, because at the end of the day, capitalism gives you so much more good. There's no perfect system in the United States, but capitalism is by far the least imperfect. And through our Bill of Rights and our Constitution, we have the medium, if it's properly executed, to make right where there has been wrong. Yeah. Where no other form of government gives you that opportunity. Yeah, I mean, based on your story and pretty much everybody we interview, similar to how Castro's regime rose up with Batista and was the savior in that sense. They used moments of weakness, moments of chaos, moments of insecurity and a crisis to rise to power and to normalize their crazy ideas, because people are in a state of mind where they're willing to
embrace maybe more radical ideas and have them normalized in their mind if it means getting out of the current situation they're in. And so I think we're facing that a lot today with the radical left, trying to normalize their crazy ideas to solve all of the either real or manufactured crises that they've created. And the best thing we can do is interview people like you that can share their story. So thank you. We appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey guys, it's Morgan. Before we head out, I just want to say thank you for watching The Freedom Records, and thank you so much to American Journey Experience for letting us film here in Dallas, Texas at their vault. You guys, this place is filled with world and American history artifacts. It's fascinating to learn the details of the objects that are right behind us on set. So thank you to American Journey Experience for letting us film here, and actually, you guys can come here yourself, so go to the link in our bio to learn how you can do that and how you can get connected to this great place.